here there are already literary discussions going on in the first row. That's the spirit of the series. Welcome, good evening. My name is Vincent Hiediger. I'm a professor of cinema studies at Goethe University and one of the curators, conveners of this series. And it is our privilege in this series to be able to bring the people best qualified to speak about the films that we screen to Frankfurt and to have them give us an introduction and then be present for the conversation. Tonight's guest is not someone we bring in just like that. Bishnupriya Ghosh is actually a very old friend and someone who's been part of my journey here in Frankfurt ever since I first moved here in 2011. I think your first talk here in Frankfurt was in 2012 at the annual conference of the Gesellschaft für Medienwissenschaft, where you and Bhaskar Sarkar gave a keynote talk, and you've been coming back quite often ever since, and it's always been a great experience and an intellectually stimulating event every time. So the person I'm presenting to you tonight is a friend and interlocutor who's been very, very important for us here and for me personally for quite some time now. Bishnupriya Ghosh is professor of English and Global Studies at the University of California at Santa Barbara, where you've been, I think, for going on 15 years. Going on 20. She earned her PhD from the Presidency, her BA from the Presidency College in Calcutta, and then another BA from Wellesley College, and her PhD from Northwestern University in English. And she's been, as I said, at Santa Barbara for quite some time now. She's the author of many, many publications, books and essays. When Born Across Literary Cosmopolitics in the Contemporary Indian Novel, 2004 was her first book. Then came a very significant contribution to the literature on global media and global media culture, global icons, apertures to the popular, which also laid the groundwork for a longer term and large-scale research project, which you've been pursuing in various locations, Cornell, and Santa Barbara, other places, in the decade since the first publication of the book, and most recently, highly topical, pertinent, and an absolutely brilliant work at the intersection of media studies and science and technology studies, The Virus Touch, Theorizing Epidemic Media, which came out this year, earlier this year, 2023. So it's all new, all fresh, and highly, highly recommended. Together with Bhaskar Sarkar, she has edited, among other things, the Routledge Companion to Media and Risk, which came out in 2024. And for film scholars of particular importance is the fact that she has been the editor of Camera Obscura for 2 years now, 3 years? 2 years. So the key journal of feminist cinema studies is now in her care, and that is very exciting for the field and for the journal. In addition to everything else, she's also a specialist for Bengali cinema and Satyajit Ray, as we're going to find out right now. Bishnu, so great to have you here, please.
Okay. Thank you, Vincent, for that very generous introduction. I'm not sure how much of an expert I am, but certainly I grew up with Satyajit Ray and have, throughout my career, even while I've moved into media, been writing about him. So I really relish the opportunity to come back to him. So this is, of course, the poster. And as you know, Satyajit Ray was a graphic artist as well, and he contributed and made some of the posters. This particular film is one of my favorites because it also was a departure from everything that came before. So, you know, the Opus trilogy, of course, 1955, Pathir Panchali, with which this series began. Then you have two other films in the Opus trilogy in 1956 and 1959. And so you have those sort of what is considered those neorealist films. Then you have what has been talked about as Ray's romance with Bengal's feudal past. So Debi, 1960, Charulata, 1964, and The Music Room, 1958. So these films have all happened before this, and it's not like he has not made films about the contemporary. Right, and particularly one of you have, of course, young Opus from the Opus trilogy arrive in Calcutta, and the city is a kind of a character. And without giving away too much of the plot, I'd say I consider Calcutta as one of the sort of protagonists, right, in this film. And more importantly is Mohanagar, or this film called The Big City that he makes in 1963. And I'll just show you a silent clip. This is the end of the film. And it's a very different film. It's got the same quality of this big city kind of eating up or encompassing the main characters. But you'll see here a kind of a reconciliation, which is much harder in the film that you'll watch. So let me just play this. And I'll play it silently. Okay. So, Pratidwandi then, this is of course Satyajit Ray's muse, Madhavi Mukherjee, and you'll see this couple sort of walking into the city and being absorbed into the crowd. Pratidwandi, or The Adversary, the film that you'll see today, really broke the mold. In some ways because Satyajit Ray felt compelled to respond to a city that was in political and social turmoil. And he felt pressured to make a political film, right? So this was rather unusual for him. And he said when he finished the film in August of 1970, he said it was the most provocative film that he had ever made. And the reason was because he had been considered a Bengali bourgeois intellectual. People talked about how he talked about characters, their self-realization, their human relationships, and he didn't make the kind of political cinema better known for his contemporaries like Mrinal Sen and Ritik Ghatak. Here too, in Mohanagar, the film that you saw, he takes up female subjectivity. And Madhavi Mukherjee, who's in that film, also stars as Charulata, another beautiful sort of treatment of the new woman subject in the 19th century Bengal. Here, he takes on the crisis of masculinity, and a masculinity that is in the clutches of patriarchy. So it's an unusual film in that way as well. And you see this inner war. The protagonist is unemployed, frustrated young man. But it's still really about his inner war. And this is what raises eyebrows about, well, he's making a political film, but he's still focusing on the male subject and subjectivity as central to it. But in an essay written a year after Pratidwandi, Ray had reacted very sharply to the Indian New Wave, and that insisted on what he called ferreting out minority subjects tucked away in the corners of the country. And why do this when they're all around us, he said, in large numbers. And you'll see here with the main character Siddhartha out of job, unemployed, that the minority subject is already in the city, in this globalizing metropolis. The films that you see here are the three films that Mrinal Sen, the director whose 100th anniversary we celebrate this year. Mrinal Sen is his Marxist contemporary. He made these three films, Interview, 1970, that's the first one, Calcutta 71, made in 1971, and Padhatik, made in 1973. And Ray, too, in the same years, he's making these films. He's making PRATIDWANDI, about unemployment and lost illusions. The second one is Shimabadda, or The Company Limited. This is made in 1971. And it's about a young executive in a British manufacturing firm who basically loses his ideals because of his job, right? And the third one, even harsher, Jono Orono, the last one, The Middleman, 1975, which is a searing tale of corruption and moral decline. And of course, Dhritiman Chatterjee, the actor who will play the main role, Siddhartha, in the film that we'll see, also stars in the 1973 Padatik. Sorry, in the Sen's oeuvre. So there's an extensive debate about the differences between these two giants, Mrinal Sen and Satyajit Ray, and I won't go into that very deeply. What is interesting in these city films, the 6 films that you see here, is that Calcutta emerges as both a city of promise and of loss, a city of revolutionary movements, post-colonial disillusion, and a precarious survival in the maw, or the gullet, the voracious gullet of the metropolis. So in some ways, I think I was talking to some people earlier that a lot of people read the adversary as, you know, 2 parts of Siddhartha warring with each other. Some people see it as a war between his younger brother, who's a revolutionary, as opposed to Siddhartha, who has sort of become a cog in the industrial capitalist wheel, right? They often read the 2 brothers as adversaries, but I actually see the city as the greatest adversary, very beloved, very alluring, but also threatening to this young man. So without giving away too much, I'll talk a little bit about this local context, this decaying colonial city, morphing with the influx of refugees from East Pakistan. Remember, 1947 is the partition. You have East Bengal become East Pakistan. And by the 1950s, you have an influx of refugees into the city. And this is quite important to the film. And it's also a city that's opening to global corporate capital. This bristling unrest of the city, I'll suggest, presses upon the very elegant composition of the on-screen filmic world, and it alerts us to an unfolding history. Audiences who saw the film in late 1970 had very strong reactions to it, partly because it touched upon events that were becoming rawer and more painful by the moment, namely the increase in police brutality against student activists in the Naxalite movement. Calcutta was in an uproar. 1967 saw the formation of the United Front government, a coalition of leftist parties that had dislodged the Indian Congress, in the state elections for the first time. This was followed by a food crisis of the mid-60s that elicited a rare public comment from Ray, who really didn't comment so much on politics. Industry stagnated, power cuts abounded, unemployment was widespread. Meanwhile, huge rifts between the United Front led to massive political unrest. And one of the things that happens very famously is that the CPIM, the Communist Party of India Marxist wing, which then comes into power and stays for 30 years in West Bengal, there's a faction that splits off from it. And this becomes, of course, they occupy excess lands in Naxalbari in North Bengal, and the Naxal movement is born in 1967. And this is sort of, coextensive with a lot of global student movements of the time. So for the Naxal movement is launched by Charu Majumdar on May 1st, 1969, and he calls for armed revolution. Okay. Let's see. Maybe it's got a little stuck. Oh. Okay, thank you. So the state response to the Naxal movement is immediate and it's brutal. By the time the film is screened, the brutality had become apparent. There were tales of students being shot in front of their parents, of torture in prisons, of unclaimed bodies floating in canals. Hence, some of the audiences who encountered the ambivalent and questioning protagonist, Siddhartha, that you'll see in the film, were noticeably upset. There was one screening in Jadavpur University where Ray was giving comments on Pratidwandi that he'd finished, and he was shouted down. And Dhritiman Chatterjee, the actor who plays Siddhartha, often said that people either loved Pratidwandi or they hated it. Since the film had touched some kind of nerve. Now, the other thing that's happening at the same time is, of course, the big support of Vietnam in Calcutta, right? The Vietnam War. And there's a whole history of global South resistance movements. And in Calcutta, in particular, there were these huge processions that went out saying, Amar Nam, Tomar Nam, Vietnam, right? My name and your name, we are all Vietnam. And this Vietnam reference, you'll notice, appears in Pratidwandi pretty early in the film. I won't tell you what it is, but the exact quote is taken from the Nokshal mouthpiece, Deshabrati, Vietnam issue of February 5th, 1970. And this is quite important because this is one of the curious things about Pratidwandi, is it begins the events are about mid-April 1970, and I'll just explain why. And it goes on till about August. And so the film is actually shot contemporaneously as these events are unfolding. But why is this important? Let's take a closer look. In the third sequence of the film, we have a reference to the moon landing of July 20th, 1969. And there's a reference to it, and we are told that this happened in the last decade, right? So Ray is extremely careful about dating his films. So we know then, if it's the last decade, we're in the 1970s. Two other historical details crop up to refine the time. The first is a dream sequence in which Siddhartha imagines his young brother, the revolutionary, being shot by the police. And the second is Tunu, his brother's departure to the villages. And if you actually look at the dates for this is something that Aniruddha Dhar's essay in Bengali actually gives these precise locations. In response to the Nokshal agenda announced in 1969, a police cell was formed to tackle the Nokshal problem on April 18th, 1970. We see in the film, Tunu has sustained an injury, and Siddhartha's sense of dread mounts, becoming the stuff of nightmares. A few days later, after this police cell, 23rd April 1970, Charu Majumdar issues a call for all youth to take up arms but move to the villages. And so, of course, Tunu, we see, faithfully answers the call, and he packs his bags and he moves to the villages. Further, to date the film, we notice that none of the actors are wearing winter gear, and Calcuttans are famously averse to the cold weather. So, and most of the waiting interviewees they're perspiring, right? So we know this is sort of summer is coming, has come. These details are important in understanding the keenness of Siddhartha's loss, the lost promise of his own revolutionary idealism, and following his decision to become a cog in the industrial capitalist machine he once vowed to overthrow. The loss is accentuated because Tunu, his younger brother, continues on the true path, so to speak. We are given to believe Tunu is made of sterner stuff as he watches the beheading of a chicken in a flashback to the brother's childhood. The more sensitive Siddhartha closes his eyes. In another memorable scene between the two brothers, and this one, which again I'll play without sound, but it's a remarkable sequence. Tunu reminds Siddhartha that he had given him the Che's biography as a gift. And you'll notice against the precise dating, okay, in the dedication page. As Tunu leaves the room, having accused Siddhartha of becoming a cog in the wheel, Siddhartha opens the dedication page, and it is 8th July 1969. You'll recognize a remarkable morph of Siddhartha into the Che-like visage for a split second. So there you see the date. The revolutionary global icon, the aperture for imagining revolutions. We are given to understand that Siddhartha was fervently idealistic then in July 1969. It is now only 9 months later, and things have happened that Siddhartha has to abandon his revolutionary dream altogether. This precise dating in the film enables the audience to grasp the emotional intensity of Siddharth's inner conflict. And there's lots written about this failure of idealism. Let me wait till this. Okay. Two interviews bookend this narrative arc. They involve anticipation, and I'll play you one of them. The preparing, dressing, hanging on a bus, perspiring, pacing, the lead up to the interviews are all about promise and wanting to stabilize a middle-class life. As we watched 213 plus young men wait for 4 positions, we share their futility, their trepidation, their physical exhaustion, their spiraling anxieties. Will the interview be in English? I wish I had a suit and tie like that guy. These are the comments that the young men exchange between them. The promise of employment is made more poignant in the face of national promises of economic equality. And we watch Siddhartha going into a movie theater and Indira Gandhi, who's then the Prime Minister of India, and she announces this promise of a wealth tax, a tax on the wealthy. Predictably, Siddhartha, watching this national promise, dozes off. Tunu embodies a third promise, the promise of armed revolution that births radical social change. Siddhartha may have been a part of these ideals, but his current position, all he can muster, is nostalgia for a childhood long past. So this is the Indira Gandhi sequence. And it's a very short sequence in a movie theater that I don't want to give away too much there. But here is one other promise I think that is really important. One of the things that you recurrently hear is the 3 siblings, the younger brother, Siddhartha, and his sister, Topu, in a village, a kind of an idealized, unlocalized setting, right? And we think this is East Bengal, right? That they have moved from the village in East Bengal to the city. And the reason we believe that is because the mother has a very strong Bengal or East Bengali accent that will be immediately recognizable to people, right? And the children actually don't have the accent, right? So they obviously grew up in the city. When we meet Siddhartha, he's about 25 years old. So he must have spent some years of his childhood in the village with his siblings. And so you have this sense that in 1970, he's 25, they've moved to the city and they've moved to a mansion in North Calcutta where they live in some crowded rooms and a shared bathroom, a very typical story of migration into the city. But it is really the audience's knowledge of PRATIDWANDI as a Sunil Ganguly story that seals the deal. And I got this amazing prop from Christian Weiss here in the first row. This is the German translation of that was done of the Sunil Ganguly novel, Adversary. And it was done in 2002, I believe. Yeah. So Alok Ranjan Dashgupta did the translation. So it is, Sunil Ganguly is one of the biggest literary giants who writes in Bengali. And we know, of course, that he's a chronicler of refugees from East Bengal. Audiences might even know that Siddhartha's predicament reflected Ganguly's own joblessness between 1964 and 1965. We know that the writer viewed the film inscription of his novel with pleasure, especially delighted with the fact that Ray altered the ending. And I won't say again more about that now. For Ray, Ganguly was a visual writer whose characters, incidents, relationships are all largely built up by means of sensitively observed external details, a fundamentally cinematic device, as Ray called it. You'll notice how observed details, which I'll get to in a minute, betray simmering emotions, even murderous rage, while actual outbursts remain few. Not only Ganguly's visuality, but it was actually the literary character of Siddhartha, an introspective figure troubled by the political world around him, that drew Ray to the novel. Critics argue that Siddhartha's inner turmoil reflected Ray's own about his time. The Ganguly stamp immediately locates this family's tribulations and broken dreams in the larger arc of East Bengali migration and its extensive material consequences. And this is, of course, Ritwik Ghatak is the person whose cinema addresses this. There's much more to say here about, and I'll wait for the discussion. There's a lot to say about what happens with this migration, because Siddhartha's family has a very precarious hold on middle-class life. He complains about a broken teacup. He's very worried about his sister being a prey to a sexual predator. They live in these close confines, and there's a kind of an intimacy between brother and sister, kind of an inward-turned intimacy of this family. There's a lot to say about the gender dynamic here, of course. And she is very much like Arati before her, the Madhavi Mukherjee that you saw in Mahanagar. But her aspirations for a better life in this film are important, but they only insofar as they bring out a crisis in Siddhartha's masculinity. So this film is very much about masculinity. Let's save this for discussion. But to finish up on the promises, we see Siddhartha most at home in his friend's hostel room as his two best friends continue with their education at Calcutta's renowned medical college. In many respects, he's most at home in this cramped homosocial space, temporary dregs for the one who has a precarious foothold in the city. Our protagonist's lost education, the meritocracy's promise to the city's brightest, flashes up several times as Siddhartha remembers anatomy lessons. And these are kind of weird. They're these anatomy lessons that he remembers from college, and they flash up at odd points in the film, as you'll see. And he tunes in to how we are all equal in our underlying vital infrastructure of bones, nerves, arteries, and muscles. But it is flesh, dress, gesture, speech, and comportment that introduce difference, markers of indulgence and poshness in Siddhartha's sharpened class consciousness. And finally, you have, of course, Kea, a woman, Bengali woman who's moved from Delhi. She's also an immigrant, and there are mid-flickers of repose. They're going on these big double-decker buses from which you can see the whole gleaming city, and those are part of the pleasurable moments in the film. It's a promissory city that shimmers in PRATIDWANDI, and here you see the Tata Center, which is one of the tallest buildings in Calcutta at the time, and everybody was fascinated. I remember being fascinated about it when I was a child. And of course, it's lovingly rendered by Ray, who in Siddhartha's voice declares he'll never really leave the city that was becoming impossible to live in. But before I turn to Calcutta, two contexts, one cinematic and other political. There is one sequence that you'll see in which there is a figure that we never see, but we hear Satyajit Ray's deep voice. As the voice drones on, imparting advice to Siddhartha, who completely tunes it out, a generational difference emerges between this elder, Ray figure, and the disenchanted youth. It may be noted that Ray himself handpicked Dhritiman Chatterjee from Presidency College, Ray's own alma mater, my alma mater as well, when Chatterjee had just finished his degree and was looking for a job. So he was jobless when Ray picks him up. Presidency College was also the hotbed of the Nakshal movement at the time, and Chatterjee had been in the company of several Nakshalites. Such direct self-insertion is very rare in Satyajit Ray, and it's a part of this new wave self-consciousness about the apparatus, the directorial eye, and so on. I don't want to give away a lot in the film, so I'll just say that. Newer still is his allusions to international auteurs past the neorealists. You'll notice the reference to Ingmar Bergman's persona in 1966 in a play with film negatives. Returning in 4 or 5 sequences, Bergman is obliquely present when Siddhartha and Shiben watch an uncensored Swedish film at the Calcutta Film Society screening. And Ray was, of course, somebody who started the Calcutta Film Society with others. The film is feminist film director Mai Zetterling's Flickorana or Girls, 1968, starring Bibi Andersson, who plays Alma in persona. If there is a direct referent, it's Tomás Alia Gutierrez's Memories of Underdevelopment, which made film festival circuits in 1968. As Sergio inhabits Havana as a city, the Paris of the Caribbean that is now in decline, we are reminded of Siddhartha's sojourns in the decaying city of Calcutta. Both cities are caught in revolutionary aftermath. Both protagonists are disillusioned, self-searching. And formally, there are some matches with the bus sequence, etc. All to say, and this is where I started, we see a new style in Pratidwandi that gestures toward the cinema of the mid-60s as it does to the place of film culture in an increasingly saturated mediascape. Ray rather explicitly locates cinema's audiovisual capacities within other ecologies, other image and audio cultures, glam photography, magazines, there's a bootleg Playboy and women's magazines, anatomical diagrams, radio, political speeches, posters, and graffiti. And there's a sequence in which he imagines himself while he's waiting for his pants to be sewn up in this photographic shoot. This media ecology reflects on the promise of cinema as the most faithful to the complexity of modern subjectivity. Photographs may be aspirational, as we saw, but they're delusional in the scope of things. We see Siddhartha's projection of himself in a photo shoot in a jump cut, dressed in a suit he will never own, in a hothouse he will never visit. Radio advertisements and political incantations are equally alluring, extending the field of desire. In this regard, Pratidwandi is reflexive about cinema's own propensities to become a dream machine, profoundly successful Bengali commercial cinema at this phase, and the generational appeal of his own art cinema, now pressed to compete with not other cinemas and new technologies of desire. So within Bengali cinema, I've hinted about the cinematic situation of Rays' Calcutta trilogy vis-a-vis Mrinal Sen. And there's a reference in Sen's interview. There's a tram sequence that is very much, you'll see a long extended bus sequence of Siddhartha going to the interview. So there are a lot of sort of back and forth, even though they have considered such different directors. And there's other resonances the two directors take up. For instance, their treatments of women as sexual prey in the workplace in Mahanagar, 1963, and Pratidwandi for Ray, and in Aktin Pratidin in 1979 for Sen. What is different about them, though, is that Sen features these large conflagrations in the city. And there are just two big explosions that happen in Pratidwandi. But mostly, things simmer. Difference between people, class difference simmers beneath and between people. And so one of the things that we are asked to notice again and again are the details. Ceiling fans, for instance, which will become very important in the next film, Company Limited. Siddhartha notices the gold buttons on Mr. Shanyal, Topu's boss's white kurta. He registers the gleaming ceiling fans in the Sanyal residence as opposed to those in the interview corridor of the public building. The second shot is a rather bad one, but you'll see these old broken fans in the public buildings. He registers Kea's aunt's extreme affectation in swallowing a tablet as a gendered class performance. Other details are offered up to the audience. I won't say much about this, but you'll notice that mostly in three interiors, the mise en scène. This is the crowded building in which the Chaudhary family, Tunu, Topu, Siddhartha, and his mother live. Then you have a very, very solidly middle-class family, Kea's family, who've arrived from Delhi. And then you have this sort of posh New Alipur residence of his sister's boss's house that he visits. And what is interesting is it's not just the spaces and the details and the furniture, but it's also the way in which Siddhartha occupies these spaces. You'll notice that he sort of stands in a cramped way at the doorway to Mr. Sanyal's house, and you'll notice the intimacy of the hostel space that he occupies, right? So in this way, in the cinematic context, you might place Pratidwandi in the venerable history of city films through the 20th century. The distracted eye catches the frenetic kineticism of Calcutta in the rush of traffic, the thick of bodies, and sheer cacophony. More specifically, one point of reference is a seminal city film, Nimai Ghosh's Chinnomul, meaning the torn root, again about refugee colonies that are growing up around South Calcutta after the partition. The film is made 1948-49, so very raw, right after partition. And this is it's a terrible version of Chinnomul, but you'll see this notion of this frantic city sort of eating up the protagonists in this sequence. Writing about this film, Moinak Bishash argues, the city as it appears on screen is an entity in formation, a place that has just woken up to history itself. And I think a similar thing can be said about Pratidwandi. It's a city in process of becoming something else, in social enemy and political upheaval, both regional and international. The city as an organism wears its marks in these film spaces, capturing our visual sensorium. Impossible as it is to chart all the writing on the wall, we notice that much public space is plastered with political signage, posters, scuff marks, and spit. And so the city space itself is really, really important in Pratidwandi. And I'm just going to, this is a sequence that I'll just show you a brief clip of. It shows you a little bit of the city walls. And it'll come back, of course, when you watch it in the film, it has a very specific face. You'll notice the hammer and sickle, the Marxist symbol of the CPIM. Oops, sorry, okay. Signs of revolution like the hammer and sickle symbol catch even the most distracted eye. In other sequences, Siddharth is literally cradled against the wall of political signage at critical moments in the film. And so here's sort of my reading of what's happening with the city in this film. This signage beckons the cinematic surrounds of a city on the brink of change. The surrounds that are theorized by the Black critics Stefano Harney and Fred Moten's Theft of Assembly in their new book, All Incomplete, 2021, they talk about Black social life as the surrounds that are around orchestrating political acts. Say, you know, the I Have a Dream speech, which is a composition, a speech. But the huge, complicated intensities of Black social life are its surrounds, not entirely legible in its complexities and contradictions to the aesthetic composition of politics proper. Drawing on cinema, Harney and Moten speak of a fort in films as a false image because it partitions away the surrounds that make it a fort, those threatening hordes that might advance, the hordes one senses but might not see visually or hear. Even when they appear as on or off-screen traces, they gesture beyond the frame to a much larger perceived space, as Henri Lefebvre might call it, that one feels but whose borders are inchoate. In other words, there are almost always more of them. This notion of what accompanies any attempt to frame political life is very salient to Pratidwandi, for we feel Calcutta as the surrounds, stretching far beyond the on-screen and off-screen space. In Brian Larkin's term, we apprehend the city sensorially. We intuit it from partial knowledge presented in the film. We anticipate the city as constantly coming at us. One key moment underscores the point. And this is a very striking scene in which Kea and Siddhartha is on top of the Tata Center that you saw. So there's this kind of unfinished roof, and they're looking over the city. The view is spectacular. It's the planner's view, looking down on the colonial city, the magnificent Victoria Memorial, the Birla Planetarium, the Chaurangi Thoroughfare, the Maidan or Commons or the lungs of Calcutta, stretching towards the race courses and Dalhousie with the government offices. Siddhartha and Kea can see the monument, the Shahid Minar, in a distance where the political parties gather. It is the very place from which Charu Majumdar launched the Nakshal movement in 1969. On this occasion, film historians note there was a gathering on this particular thing that they're watching on April 22nd, 1970 to commemorate Lenin's birthday. A statue of Lenin had arrived from Russia. In the film, though, we can't hear the speeches. So the gathering is sutured with the launch of the Nakshal movement, an intuition seizing the whole from partial knowledge. Speeches waft towards the couple, exhorting change. They land painfully for Siddhartha, who worries about his brother. So we actually just hear traces of speeches. We remember the launch of the Nakshal movement, but we can't really hear what's going on. Siddhartha worries, what is the call this time? Will it reshape the city? And therein his right. We strain to catch the words as they arrive in sonic fragments, much like the visual fragments of graffiti that we lose in the kinetic rush of the city. Revolution is audiovisual sensorum. It is not fully processed, and yet it is coming from the surrounds of the encoded images. This sense of siege is ever present in Satyajit's Rays' accounts of making films in the city. In confronting the question, this is the essay that he writes, he says, "Here, while a shot is taken, one holds one's breath for fear the lights might go down the middle of the shot, either of their own accord or through a drop in the voltage. One holds one's breath while the camera rolls on the trolley lest the wheels encounter a pothole on the studio floor and wobble, thus ruining the shot. One holds one's breath on the location in fear of a crowd emerging out of the blue come to watch the film. How can shooting ever work? No wonder filmmakers become prone to heart diseases." So the city, with its decaying infrastructure and curious crowd, just happens, right? Taking the film unit by surprise. It arrives in unexpected ways, introducing uncertainty. And so you'll notice that in the film, the image of the city's sort of decay is the electricity. Right? There are fuse boxes and power cuts, a sagging infrastructure of Calcutta at the time, and the constantly perspiring bodies. The encoding of electricity gestures towards Ray's sense that designing film locations, here Calcutta, is a collaborative and interpretive partner. And one has to become one with the location rather than the location being a product of the directorial, creative, and independent vision. These material agencies of location can prove frustrating, changing the parameters of filming despite all attempts as authorial control. And this is a director who is extremely controlled. Every detail is worked out. Ray writes about the challenges of power cuts, for instance, that it posed to shooting, not only impacting lighting design, but also the sheer energies of acting and shooting. In all these ways, Calcutta in 1970 is the cinematic surrounds impinging on the filmic event. So these details, right, these surrounds, surround a very carefully constructed filmic place. And this is my last point. The city is encoded as intensely local and intensely cosmopolitan. In the very first sequences, you'll notice that Siddhartha rushes. He's going to the interview. He needs to have a button on his pants sewn. And he goes to this new sort of tailor shop, and they say, oh, we don't do that kind of stuff here. So he goes to one of the old Muslim guilds, and this tailor basically gives him a lungi, a cloth to wrap around him while he waits for his button to be sewn. So it's a very slight detail, but you see the kind of the corporate shops coming into the city. Calcutta is an entity in formation, as much because of its social upheaval as its new imbrications in global capital. And one of the things that you might catch is when he's in Topu's boss's house, the rich guy, the guy gets an international call. We used to call it trunk calls. They had to be booked. And then you go, somebody calls from abroad and there's a trunk call and you go and you hear Mr. Chanel, shouting into the phone. And you realize this is a kind of an international honcho of sorts, right? Another hint is that he's leaning against the wall of a building, and the Dastur and Company, there's a sign behind him. And Dastur and Company was an architectural firm, international, who was very early in the business of building Dubai, right? So there are all these very careful details which encode the city. You also see hippies as moneyed youth from the West. And there's a very interesting sequence in which he sees the hippies come on one end, and there's a bundle, what looks like a bundle of rags, turns out to be a beggar on the other, right? So there is this sort of setting of Calcutta in a cosmopolitan and international context, as well as very local. It's also very locally cosmopolitan, and I'll wind up here. But the cosmopolitanism is not fetishized. It's kind of harsh, actually. Siddhartha's rich friend can afford a sex worker, and a Chinese meal turns out to be rather racist and sexist in his interactions with the non-Bengali others, the Anglo-Indians and the Chinese in Calcutta. Perhaps it's his adherence to money that firms up his culturally hegemonic relations, making him deeply cynical. He is what Siddhartha could become. In this subplot, Ray remains firmly committed to class conflict as the basis of gendered and racially inflected relations. All these particulars locate Calcutta culturally and politically a striated city of class-marked neighborhoods, always already global in its networks. Yet Calcutta is changeful, a living form on the brink of collapse, as crisis accelerates into crisis. The city is most apparent in febrile movement, kinetic crowds and rushing traffic, lights and crossing bends and corners, feet and elbows. We become aware of this constant motion when it stops, sometimes violently as in a car accident, or when it speeds up so much that we can't grasp the city as an image. These points are deeply troubling, for they are where disharmonies bubble up and erupt into chaos. Seething disharmonies rend apart any possibility of city symphonies, rend apart the family that tries to survive the greatest adversary. And so I'll leave you with one of those moments that towards the end of the film, where we are back in the interview corridor. And he has one of these anatomical visions of everybody being caught in the same situation. He sees them as skeletons, just skeletal, disappearing before his eyes. Death is the great leveler. Pops the question, will they survive? Has the city eaten its young? So I leave you to watch this film of many departures, including within Rays' own oeuvre. Thank you.
Yeah, we just noticed that the subtitles were done by Moinak Biswas, who will open the summer cycle of this series. He was a professor at Jawadhpur University, which you also mentioned in Calcutta. Well, thanks again for the wonderful introduction and for training us to watch the film so much better than I think we would have been able to do without the introduction. I was really fascinated by the motive of time and timing, and the breaking watch, the sister's watch, and then the rhythms and the waiting time, the empty time. Maybe you can say something a little bit more about the timing of it all.
Yeah, I think the watch breaking, of course, is, I mean, there's a sense of stasis, right? The interview time is heavy. But there's also the city's time is very fast. And you see that continuously. And then most strikingly in the conversation with Kea's father, there's a sense of even the time of the revolution as having very little time left because the repression is so strong, right? So there's a sense of hurtling towards something, the guillotine, etc., right? So time being stopped and the potential being almost obscured. So I think there's that sense of momentum that's failing throughout the film. At least that's the way I read it, because it's so heavily inflected by the revolutionary movement and its failure, right? So, yeah, I mean, I guess I'd say that, but there is definitely sort of modern industrial time worked into the film as ultimately just really decayed. And then there's the national time of, the Indira Gandhi proposing the wealth tax and so on and so forth.
Which makes him fall asleep, as you.
Yes, exactly. Yeah.
But there's also a sense of him struggling not to have to leave the city out of a fear of falling out of time. And that's sort of what the ending also suggests with the funeral and the rhythmic chants, and then the freeze frame. It's significant that the film ends on a freeze frame.
Yeah. And that's the change in the ending from the novel that I was talking about, because the novel actually ends with Siddhartha in this small town sort of raving and ranting. He's like walking the streets, and Shunil Gangopadhyay actually liked this ending better. You may have noticed that the film begins and ends with dead bodies. Right, so there is the sense of something being over, but he also hears the bird call, in this small town. But I showed you that part from the big city because this is such a remarkably different ending. He's actually expelled from the city, or the only way he can survive is being out of the city. And I think a lot of people didn't like that ending. That he didn't survive in the city, or so I think there is that sense of expulsion, but it's very significant that he ends up in a small town, and in much more. I think the circumstances are also it's a more poverty-stricken environment. He has a small room, but he's also more at peace. Yeah, at the end, yeah.
But I was thinking of novels like Oranyak by Bandyopadhyay,
right,
where, again, somebody who can't make a living in the city has to go to the countryside, in this case, as someone who then works as the manager of a big forest estate, and then begins sort of a voyage of discovery and...
Right.
The discovery of India and India's history that he would not have had access to in the city. So there's a deep ambiguity in Bengali literature and film about that particular relationship. And this story here is quite radically a narrative that is quite radically committed to the city as space. Right. I don't know if you.
Yeah, so. There are two, I think, outside locations. One is the village, the idealized village, and that's very much there in Chinnamul. It's the route from which you're taken, and you end up in the city, and the city is harsh, and you find these lodgings and you have a constant nostalgia for the old Bengal, etc., etc. So that's one kind of location outside the city. And that's always stuck in the past. But Ray has a series of films in which I wouldn't call it pastoral exactly, but days and nights in the forest. And people go away, a group of people go away, they go to the forest, they discover something about themselves, they learn about history. So that's the other kind of location. But also, that location as the pastoral form is never fetishized. I mean, the forest is quite harsh.
Right, yeah.
And they're nativist, and they look down on the indigenous people, and they exploit them. And so, I mean, I think it turns out that you carry all your, even here you see, you carry all your class affiliations with you,
absolutely.
When you go elsewhere.
Yeah. I mean, all the candidates have upper caste names too in the interview.
The Mukherjees,
the
Mukherjees,
the Chatterjees.
Yes, exactly.
So that's a very elite segment of people who are postulating there. And thank you all also for making us aware of the traces of the Naxalite history,
right?
Which wouldn't be easily readable.
No.
just from the information the film gives us like this. But then once you become aware of that history of the sort of the Maoist guerrilla movement that is clearly inspired by the Viet Cong and the Vietnamese War, a whole different history of the country, city-countryside divide, a potentially revolutionary history comes into play, because for the Naxalite movement, the countryside is the place where supposedly the revolution starts, and where you advance history to the point of reforming the city then. And he's clearly the protagonist of this film, even though he confesses or professes his admiration for the Vietnamese people. That's not his story, but his brother's story.
It is his brother's story, yeah. And so the Naxalite movement was essentially a Maoist revolution, which went away. Naxalbari is North Bengal. The idea was to go and transform from the villages and the armed struggle in the villages. And Tunu's clearly coded as that. I mean, yeah, he's very light. The Naxal movement is a light touch. But we are shown Tunu's leg injury twice. Right, yes. Yeah, and so you can't help not do it. Somebody has intricate at Satyajit Ray wouldn't show that twice if it wasn't to mean something, right? So clearly it's coded, and we have a sense that, you know, Tunu will become one of the many young men who, a lot of them from Presidency College students who died in the Naxal movement. Right. So there's a kind of a very heavy shadow. It's his alma mater. You know, the students are being shot in front of their parents, which was a whole thing at that time. And he has become the father figure who's seeing his brother shot. Right. So yeah, there is definitely a finding of history outside, and always outside the city. But it is also interesting that so much of Calcutta in this film is deeply historical. You know, especially that big, you know, when he's seeing the speech, is amazing scene.
That is just such an incredible scene, and a cityscape. One detail that fascinated me is in the moment of separation, when the brother decides to leave and pack up and rack up. Yeah. The key prop in the scene is the bag, the British Overseas Airlines Company bag, which of course stands sort of for the continuing imbrication of India in the whatever's left of the empire, and it's a counterpoint to the life that he's choosing. So it's just an interesting little detail, and also an indication of how Ray works, that the whole scene is built around him being busy emptying that bag. It's not clear what he's looking for. His purse, apparently. You expect him to start packing the bag or something, but ultimately the bag remains empty. So.
Yeah, and I think there, again, a very light layer, and Trace, thanks for bringing that up. The idea of he migrates outside of Calcutta to a small, you know, village, town, we call it the Mopasal. But there are people who migrate and go to England for study. Yes. You know, so the BOSC definitely indicates another kind of diaspora, another kind of leaving altogether. But throughout the film, the other very delicate thing is not just the interiors, but the accents. Exactly. Yeah. Right? So the Kea's father, the industrialist, has a slight Hindiized English accent. Right, so there are different people in the film who speak different kinds of Englishes, and it indicates a kind of a hierarchy of British education still within the country. Yeah.
Yeah, the professor of medicine has like a purebred Oxbridge accent.
And even he says Siddhartha speaks kind of, you know, pretty very good, good English. Yeah.
Like if we take Oxbridge to be good English.
Yes, definitely. That's the mod.
Do we have questions, comments from the audience? Yes, Porskar, please. You should wait for the microphone so that everyone can hear you. Thank you.
Quick comment on the BOSC bag, because it also is about the moment when a lot of people start leaving India, Bengal, etc., and go to the West. So it definitely is referring to what Bishnu called the diasporic. I also want to point out that those Naxalite students who were smart enough to get out of it so that they didn't get killed often ended up in places like Chicago and Columbia as very, very famous political scientists or historians.
Yeah, you want to name names?
No.
I think we know who you're referring to.
And a lot of parents actually sent those who could afford it, just sent their kids instead of having them killed. You know, they just sent them abroad, to study. Yeah.
Exactly. Yes. Other comments, observations, questions? Yes, please. In the back.
Was censorship an issue for the movie?
No, not really. This was not, I mean, it's very delicate about the Nakshal movement. I mean, it's hardly there, And also, I think it wouldn't have had problems with the censorship certificate for obscenity, etc., because none of that. In fact, what is really interesting about this film for me is the stress on sexual frustration, right? And that's why I think it's such a treatment of masculinity. But no, it didn't have any censorship problems. This one.
Thank you.
Tagging on to that, the Swedish film was a genre term in Europe at the time, and it was code for soft porn. And apparently there were Swedish films with a similar kind of audience appeal in Bengal. That's just a question.
Yeah, well, I mean...
What about the choice of the Swedish film excerpt?
A student of ours...
It's an absolutely absurd excerpt.
And hardly anything is happening in that sense.
Yeah, and then suddenly there are two salespeople in white coats, not just one, they sort of...
And you don't see skin. It's, Zetterlings, girls. I mean, you can't... It's a feminist film. So it's not even, what it's supposed to be. But it brings up this sort of very large audience for foreign films. So when we were growing up, the international film festivals, you would have to line up for hours to see, Bergman or any of those. And the city would really turn out. People would stand in long lines. If you went to have tea, you'd put a brick with your name on it in your place and you'd go away and stand. So there's a real sort of cinema-loving audience here. So I think that was something that students in medical college and presidency would often do. It's a college culture, yeah.
Yes, I mentioned before a conversation I once had with the former cultural attaché of the Swiss embassy in Delhi, who said, in Kolkata they have film clubs that have more members than most Swiss cities have inhabitants. Yeah. Yes, please.
Yes. Did you want...
We're just thinking about the bomb exploding in the cinema. Is that self-evidence of Ray himself, or do you have anything about the bomb in the cinema?
Actually, that was a kind of a common occurrence, That's why they say, well, what were you doing? Why did you leave the film? And he had gone in there to sleep. People often do in the summer, if they can buy. And there were multiple, bombs. So the Nakshal movement was very much, in the city. Lots of things were being bombed. You hear an exchange with his younger brother about handmade bombs. So I would say that's a kind of a it's a quotidian or everyday experience about that. The Ray figure is the one who's sitting and talking to him. The guy when he's having tea and he says, "Okay, I'll come and work for the party," and by the party he actually probably means the CPIM, the main Marxist party. He said, "Why don't you come? You were in the union." But then, of course, you realize that Siddhartha had broken away and become a Naxalite. Right. So there's all the complicated politics of what is legitimate Marxism and what is not already embedded there. So, yeah.
Mm. Yeah. Yes, please, Sebastian, and then Stephen.
Yeah, there was like in the beginning these, and I think in some sparse moments during the film, these photo negative images, which I don't think I've seen that before in a Ray film. So I wanted to ask, is there like a context to that, or is that something that occurred before or after in like Ray's films? Because I don't remember.
I don't remember seeing it in a Ray film too. And this is, I think, again, the film is very realist. I mean, there's nothing totally new wave or anything about it. I think there's a nod here that we're talking about the substrate, with the negative, but they're also within the narrative itself, those negative points. It happens in the dream sequence or the nightmare sequence, and then his father's death, of course, with which we begin. They're also, I think, formally incorporated as a part of the film, right? Their traumatic moments are shot in negative, mostly. So I would say he's sort of gesturing towards sort of breaking the realist narrative, gesturing towards the cinema of the 60s, but not quite going there in the, sort of modernist sense of cinema. Yeah, but I have never seen it. I don't know if others can speak to this, but I don't recall him using the negative like that in any other film.
Thanks.
Stephen, please.
Yes, thank you. With the realism thing, one thing I noticed about the film was the use of sound and sound design, which on the one hand is the presence of the city very much, but also one that's broken and has alienating effects in that it's at times silent and then single noises come in and so on. It seems like a very artificial kind of sound, at the same time a very realistic one. Is that too part of a typical thing of Rays, or is that special in this film, or am I just making that up?
No, that's a really interesting question. I had not actually thought about it. Definitely there is, this presence of the city is part of the soundscape, I would say. And then, like when he hears, there's also encoded sound, like when he wakes up in the middle of the night and there are those cats that are yowling. And that's supposed to be a really bad omen of potential death, for instance. So, he's just been dreaming about his brother, worried about his brother and what this new police force means for someone like Tunu, and then he hears the cat. So there is very sparse sound like that often carries certain kind of encoded meanings. Then I think there is this kind of cacophony of the city in which you can't really make out what. It's just there as a background. And sometimes you're right, I hadn't thought of it. Some of it is very stilted, like when the hippies say, oh, look, a cow. And it just seems very stilted. I also find that some of the dialogue, strangely, which you don't have so much in Ray because he writes the screenplay, like when they're sitting on top and she's having ice cream and they're talking about the two of them are chatting, that's an extraordinary stilted. I find that a very stilted moment. So it is an interesting question because I think...
Excuse me,
yeah.
The ticking of the clocks in the earlier part of the film is overly loud.
It's overly loud, yeah.
Loud because it's silent otherwise, but it seems also really overly loud.
Yeah.
As at one point, pointing to what you said about the time and so on is the element, but also one that seems to make it an unrealistic moment in the film.
Yeah, I think, Vincent's first question. Yeah, the time is definitely out of whack. It's either too fast or too slow. It's just not working, the time itself in this milieu. But what you're saying reminds me that he's trying something new. So some of the parts of the film, the sounds artificial. And then at other parts, like with the cat and the clock, I think it's highly symbolic. Right? So it sounds artificial because it's not it's more internal or, yeah. That's it. Okay. thank you for introducing me to the German version. That was great. Yes,
Okay.
of course.
Thank you. Good night. Yeah. Yes, Danny, please.
Sorry, you just said the time is out of whack. I thought you were going to say the time is out of joint.
Yes, that too.
Is Siddhartha a Hamlet figure? Is that a way to approach
Absolutely.
him?
Yeah.
I mean, the other thing I was thinking about, it's this commonplace around the time of the Arab Spring to ascribe it to a kind of middle class, a young middle class that was both overeducated and underemployed. That seems to be exactly what Satyajit Ray is showing us here. This army of young men who seem to be extremely well educated, actually, but they're like fighting over this handful of jobs. They're not giving the jobs that they're being employed for. Was that also a kind of, let's say, a condition for this kind of revolt that was taking place at the time?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, part of it is, the student movements, they're global at this time. So the Nakshal movement in that way is not terribly unusual, though it comes out of a particular context. I think there is the sense by the mid-60s at least, there was this very well-known a chief minister or governor of Bengal, Bidhan Chandra Rai, who had made funding possible for the first, Pather Panchali, and he had passed away. And so the Congress government, which in the various states had been, of course, the people who came in right after the India got independence, right? There were signs of cracking there, that they had not quite delivered on, poverty alleviation, a lot of things that the new country that had been independent was like really wanted to have everybody. It was a democratic socialist republic. But it clearly hadn't worked, right? So there was parts, so I'd say, Danny, I'd had two. One is a real sense of failure about India and about Bengal. There'd been a food crisis by 1965, right? So there was a real sense that this poverty, this poor nation, right, had not quite delivered to everybody. So the students were very much a part of that socialist revolutionary movement on the one hand. And then you had the fact that you had no jobs. And particularly with people like Siddhartha, who had come in from East Bengal, they were struggling, they didn't have, they were trying to make roots in a city that didn't allow for roots. So that was, Calcutta itself, the population had exploded by 1970. So yes, I don't know if I would, how much, I would say there's a non-linear causality between the two. There is unemployment and disillusion on the one hand, and then there was this failure of this socialist revolutionary dream on the other. And the two together, somewhere in that space, right, you have both the revolution and its failure coming up. Yeah.
There's a new book out this year by Ashok Modi, who's an economist, an economic history of India, which is a history of India's failure to create jobs, essentially, like from Nehru to everyone. And every chapter has a longer discussion of a film, and he loves this film. As the illustration of everything that's wrong with Indira Gandhi's policies in the 70s, basically.
Right. It's a critique of that policy. But also, the other thing I would say, I mean, now I'm thinking more about your question, is that by the mid-70s, in Hindi cinema, for instance, you had the rise of the angry young man. I mean, this was a figure that came straight out of post-colonial disillusionment and the fact that, there were all these young men who were not, and so there was a kind of, I guess the traditional way of thinking about it, they were the lumpen proletariat par excellence, but they were just these, young men with a lot of energy, some educated, some not, but no jobs, creating political.
I mean, they're played by actors who are as educated as the characters in this film, but they're playing working class characters, right. The angry young man. Bhaskar wanted to comment.
It's also, in the interview the young men in the interview are done quite well because they are of different kind of backgrounds and different educational levels. You know, some are worrying about English, etc., etc.
I want to talk a little bit about the time factor. If you take the all India kind of thing, there's this whole concept of time pass. And it comes up around this time because a lot of people who have bachelor's degrees can't get a job. We're talking hundreds of thousands all over the place. So I remember this joke, MBBS, which literally means must. It's a degree acronym for a degree in medicine. What Siddhartha was going after before his father passed away. But the joke was MBBS was Ma Babar Bekar Shantan, which literally means a parent's jobless son. You know, mother and father's jobless son. And that was sort of the condition because highly educated people couldn't get even the most idiotic jobs. So time pass sort of became a way of passing time. So now you often hear, this film is okay, it's just time pass. It comes from this moment, I think, because it's this idea. There's a whole book someone's written about time passing in Chandigarh, I think. It's an ethnography of people just sitting on the barracks or the balconies or steps coming out of big buildings, and just, I did that as a student, like spending hours just talking about things, often politics, but also world affairs, but also women or whatever. But the big thing I wanted to point out is that we are talking about Bengal. And so imagine between 1946 and 1951-52, a few million people pouring into the city of Calcutta as refugees from the partition riots, right after the partition, or starting even before. So that's one moment, and that causes a whole lot of pressure. Punjab and Bengal have seen some of the most politicized, militant movements with Khalistan, where that led to the killing of Indira Gandhi by 1984. And in Bengal too, it's really interesting. The commercial film industry produced such extraordinarily violent films about the pre-partition independence movement. Gandhi is lionized in the West, but it's not Gandhi who necessarily just by himself got us freedom. There's a very strong, very militant movement. And constantly in Bengal, in the Bengal industry, as opposed to the Bombay industry, people would keep going back and bring up those moments in Bengali history that were about killing the Brits, like what we now call terrorism. So that aspect is there, so that, even after independence, certain films had a tough time getting a certificate from the censor board because of showing extraordinary freedom fighters fighting it out with the British. Because I've read these certification tangles on this, they would say things like, it would create political unrest. Well, why? But, there's this real fear of Bengal and Bengali politics. The thing that is really important to remember is next year is going to be the war of Bangladesh. Another few million people will pour into Calcutta, particularly. And so things really changed at these two moments. One, the late 40s, and then again, early 70s. And yeah, Vishnu and I went to school about 12 years after this to Presidency College. We were sort of in-between people, not quite political. In fact, we ran for student senate on apolitical platforms that we want to do good things for the students without worrying too much about what the party was to say. About 12 years later, so it's the mid-90s, with globalization and liberalization happening, it has, by that time, time pass has become something fun, right? I mean, no one cares about politics anymore, or not in the way that they used to at this moment.
Thank you.
The two parts of time pass we see is him hanging out with his friends in the college hostel, which are actually some of the most tender moments that you get in the film, are in that small room where they're talking. And the other is when they're above the city. in the double-decker bus, or at the restaurant, and there are moments of repose there, and that is the kind of the leisure time of, you asked about history. I think the way about figuring the city out is really at those are the educational moments more than the formal education. Yeah.
And I mean the most significant of those scenes is the one on the Tata building.
Yeah, that's
which is so spectacular, but it sort of summarizes that perspective. Incidentally, in terms of economic and migration history, a part of what happened during the time past period is that a lot of those highly qualified graduates came here.
Yeah.
That is exactly the generation of the first generation of highly qualified Indian immigrants who, came with engineering degrees, medical degrees, whatever, and built lives here. So.
But also Alokranjan Dasgupta, who translated into German.
Yeah.
He was a big poet.
But also, the two other films that he makes, his city films, he doesn't really touch migration in the same way. That this is his most, he addresses it quite directly with Siddhartha's family. Like Ghatak will do so much, and Sen will do, but not Ray. And this goes back to the censor question that while there were these violent films being made that went through the censor, problems, this one is so delicate about the violence. There's a bomb in the theater. That's about it. And nothing, there's no rationale given for the violence. So, yeah. It was either hated or loved. As Riti Mancha, a lot of people, when it came... Why was it loved? So it was loved because, it was a new thing in Satyajit Ray's oeuvre with a new actor. It was his most political film till then. But right in the middle of the Nakshal movement, where the students are dying, to have the main character as one who has lost his political ideal and has so many doubts, and the question of, if I'm a revolutionary, I can't get a job and feed my family. All that doubt was taken to be quite disliked in some reception of the film. So in its time, it was either loved for what it did or hated. But after that, I think there's a lot more appreciation of the film in post the 1970s. Yeah.
But as you were saying, it was hugely contested, and
yes,
in public screenings it would be shouted down, and Ray would be shouted down when he came to Presidency College to present it. Yeah.
Although, it had Sunil Gangopadhyay's, that was the authenticating stamp that it was his novel.
Right.
And,
Okay.
Yes.
All right.
Enjoyed it.
Oh, yes.
It's actually one of my most favorite Ray films.
Right. No, and thank you for, again, presenting it to us in such a way as to make us better viewers of the film, I think. And that's the best you can hope for from an introduction like this. So thank you so much, Bishnu, for making the long way. And thank you all for coming. We will continue on December the 7th, exactly. Chal Sagar will be the film, and Amrita Biswas will talk about the restoration history and the politics of the restoration history of Ray films, and those are quite convoluted politics, fitting for Bengal, as we just learned, and very global, again, also fitting for Bengal. And for those of you who wondered about the well-informed gentleman who commented on the partition and cinema, that's Bhaskar Sarkar, and he'll be back in June.
Talking about a musical which is never seen in the West.
Yes.
But somehow you guys have the beautiful print of it.
Exactly.
So, yeah.
All right. Thank you so much, and see you again very soon.